challenges, figuring everything out. So thank you so much for your patience and sticking with us. So welcome. I'm going to dive right in. So first I'm just going to check. Everyone can hear me, and see my screen. Is that right? Okay. Yep. Greg's nodding. Awesome. Okay. All right. So welcome to the Campaign Planning and Advocacy Training of 2018. This is an hour-long webinar to share with you the campaign planning toolkit that the campaigns team here at the National Wildlife Federation has been developing over the last year. This has been a super collaborative effort. Last year, for those of you who were at the annual meeting, we held a session to share our draft of a toolkit. We got a lot of great feedback, and coming out of that, we spent the last year doing a series of focus groups, that involved folks from our affiliate family, DCPs, so they weren't DCPs when we started the focus groups, campaign leads across the organization who really contributed to make this what it is. And then coming out of that, we've just been workshopping this tool by using it on real campaigns across the organization. So it's really exciting to finally get to this point where we're able to begin sharing it with the broader Federation family, and we'll also be having 2 sessions Saturday morning at the annual meeting. So if you know of somebody who wanted to be on this webinar but couldn't make it, I'm recording it. I will cut out the part that we just heard about all the technical difficulties, so it'll be a lot snappier. And we will also have opportunities at the annual meeting to learn more about the tool. So I'm going to dive right in and start. Just get over here. Start by talking about what is this toolkit. So the campaign planning toolkit really is less what, and actually the right question is like, why did we do this toolkit? And really there are 2 reasons. One is that I think there are a lot of fantastic campaigners across the organization who do this work all the time. But I think one of the mindsets we can get into, I know I get into, is we are acting from this place of urgency and doing really what we think we can do with the resources that we have. And a lot of it is like throwing everything up against the wall to see what sticks. And sometimes we're going to have to do that. We're never going to get rid of that. We need rapid response. But I think this is a tool that will help us be a little bit more intentional and change the whole frame of thinking in the organization to be more around what we could do, what we need to do in order to achieve our goals and conserve wildlife, and what are the steps that we need to take to get there, what resources do we need to build in order to achieve that. So I think this whole campaign planning tool is really in line with our new growth mindset, and it's something, so the second thing I'll say, second reason of why, is that a lot of folks do this. They write campaign plans, they think through all of this, but a lot of times we've all been trained in various methodologies of how to plan campaigns, how to map this out, how to walk through all of these pieces. And one of the challenges with that is we end up kind of speaking a different language. So when we try and talk about what our goals are, what our strategies are, we're kind of talking across each other because we don't have shared definitions and a shared sense of how to move through our thinking when it comes to planning campaigns. So this was an attempt to pick a set of definitions. They may not be the perfect set or your favorite set, but a set of definitions that we can all agree on and use as a federation and put to work on our campaigns as much as possible. So that is the vision for this tool. That's what's really exciting about it. That's sort of the what it is and the why it is. So the goals for the next hour is to tell you a little bit more about it, show you what actually the tool looks like, and review all of the pieces, define some of the terms that we're going to use and how we're going to use them in the context of planning campaigns, and answer some questions. So there's a lot to get through. I just did a 2-day version of this in Montana, so I'm going to try and make it now about 45 minutes. So I will try and be efficient. I may not be able to get to everyone's questions. I definitely will not be able to get to everyone's questions, I should say that. But definitely reach out to me by email or phone if you have follow-ups, feedback, thoughts, questions. I'd love to hear from you all. And then hopefully many of us will see each other at the annual meeting in not too long, and we can talk more about it then too. So I'm going to just move in. So first off, what is in the toolkit? What are we actually talking about? So there are several pieces here. I'll start by explaining there is right in the middle, this isn't in a particular order, there is a campaign planning and facilitation guide, which essentially is for someone who is the lead person who is helping someone plan a campaign to really walk through all the steps and help guide you through the tool, essentially. And it really breaks out all the conversations you need to have, all the thinking you need to do throughout the process. So that's one piece. There's also worksheet number 1, which is pre-planning. And the way I've broken out these tools are into 3 worksheets that cover all the conversations you need to have before you have a big campaign planning meeting and session with all the right stakeholders, the conversations you want to have together as a big group as part of a campaign planning meeting or session, and then all the conversations you want to have afterwards to kind of clean up from that and turn all of the great brainstorms and thinking that come out of those conversations into something tangible and actionable. There's also a template PowerPoint that can be used for a campaign planning meeting that you're holding or hosting that has is a template. It's to be downloaded and modified and made to work for whatever as it's useful for your conversation. Every conversation for every campaign is going to be a little bit different, but this gives you some initial steps in that direction. There's also just some background guidance and some best practices around building out your tactics and putting them on a calendar, which I'll get into. And then there's a checklist, which walks you through, once you've done your campaign plan, how do you make this into a campaign? How do you stand it up? And it walks through all the different pieces and sort of logistical pieces and systems associated with that. All of this right now lives in the NWS Campaigns team Google Hub, which if you get our hot list every week, hot list memo, at the very top of that hot list memo every single week, there is a link to the hub. So if you're ever trying to find it, that's where it is. And this is in a folder within that. I've linked directly to it in this appointment and in the email that I sent out. And we're going to be moving this actually to the Affiliate Resources webpage so that there's a URL that folks can go to. We just weren't able to get that all up and running in time for this webinar. So hopefully I will send that out as a follow-up item once we get it on the website so folks have something that's a little easier to find, not buried in our Google Docs, but something that you can get to. Okay, let's get started. So the very first thing here is I'm going to walk through some of the pieces of worksheet 1, and I'll just actually show you what worksheet 1 looks like. Looks like a worksheet. It has some basic guidance and some fill-in-the-blanks that walks you through these conversations. But the vision here is that the first question you want to ask yourself as you're beginning to plan a campaign is, what is the goal? What is the concrete policy objective that will help achieve my strategic vision? What is a win? And one thing that really helps me think about this goal piece is by thinking about it in long-term, medium-term, and short-term. So long-term being the biggest picture you can think of, like species recovery, making sure that wildlife thrive in a rapidly changing world, one might say, to borrow a phrase. Medium term might be past a significant piece of legislation like Recovery America's Wildlife Act that will get us closer to that goal. That's not everything we do to species recovery, but it's one sort of big item. And then maybe short term, this is sort of, I think, a low-hanging fruit short term, build 2 new champions in the house. Actually, the short term on Recovery America's Wildlife Act would be 100 co-sponsors on our bill in the House by the end of 2018. That's the real goal that we have. So I think, and then what you would do is actually build the rest of your campaign plan is really working towards this first goal, this short-term goal. obviously, campaign plans change as do circumstances on the ground and in the country, but to the extent that it's possible, working towards that first short-term goal is just a nice way to kind of break it down and make it a little more actionable and less overwhelming as you're starting to think about these big visions that we have for how we're going to move forward as a country. The second piece on the worksheet that the worksheet actually walks you through is a long-term organizational outcome. So for NWF staff, one of the things you should ask is does this campaign align with our strategic plan? This is a good moment to realize this. Like one of the first conversations you're having, you don't want to figure out it doesn't align with our strategic plan after you've already finished planning your campaign. So I think for the most part, this isn't a problem. But this is another, in addition to the strategic plan alignment, this is also a moment to think about some of the other goals you have as an organization. So for example, engaging new diverse partners. We may have a goal as an organization that in order to build power and be effective, we need stronger relationships within the tribal community. So one of the goals of, say, the Keystone XL pipeline site might be reduce fossil fuel emissions and stop climate change, but one of the goals might be strengthen our relationships with our tribal partners. And what's nice about this is, particularly in times when we have really, really tough political fights, this is sometimes how we can win, by building our movement and by thinking about some of our organizational goals and how we're building power for the long term. The next piece of the worksheet, and this is still worksheet 1, it talks through strategy. And the key thing I just wanted to communicate about strategy is that it should be related directly to your goal. So you should be thinking about if you have a piece of legislation absolutely no one has ever heard of before, then your goal is maybe not to pass legislation right away, or rather your strategy is not to pass that legislation immediately, but one of your strategies might be to elevate the issue with the public and do public education. People don't want to fix a problem they don't know exists. So any campaign is going to have multiple strategies, but some common strategies you see are build champs, who are going to really fight. These are particularly decision makers who are going to help us win. Provide cover to swing targets that maybe want to vote with us but need some political safety to do that, or influence swings who are on the fence and want to move towards us. Another strategy is target clear opposition. A good example of this is the #BootPruitt campaign, where our whole goal there, we're not trying to get Scott Pruitt necessarily to suddenly decide that he cares about wildlife and climate change, but rather to make his EPA decisions so toxic that other decision makers are really want to distance themselves from those bad policies. So that's an example of like targeting someone in an oppositional way can be really effective. Those are some common ones, and I think I think a lot in the federal frame, but I think you can think about a lot more that work at a state level, regional level, and certainly things like building public education around an issue might be a strategy, or building relationships within a specific constituency that we know is important might be a strategy as well. Okay, sake of time, I'm going to keep plowing on. So also on worksheet 1 is this question of timing. So this is really a simple question. It's just how long are we going to be writing our first campaign plan for? My personal recommendation is to have it be 6 months to a year. I think because of just changing political dynamics, it's really hard to write a campaign plan that lasts much longer than that. But having said that, these are your campaigns. You get to decide what makes sense and what's right for you. So just deciding what is the length of time you're going to cover with this. Sometimes that's pre-planned. If you know there's going to be a vote on the Farm Bill, let's say, in a few months, you know that's how long your campaign is, now until that vote. And then other times it's a lot more amorphous, and you can sort of build out how long you'd like the campaign to be. This piece, milestones. this is about the key moments on the campaign that you want to be aware of. And again, this is in the pre-planning worksheet. And the reason to think about this ahead of time is just to tee up your campaign planning session. So when we get to brainstorming on things like tactics and what we're actually going to do, we have some good kind of hooks on the calendar that we know about ahead of time. So it just helps to really go into that conversation in those meetings already having some sense of some of the key moments that you should be aware of. So they can be external, things we can't control, like hearings in the legislature, election days, comment periods. It could be holidays, just things we make into a hook. We once did a whole report based off of Groundhog Day. So we can come up with lots of creative things to do as well. And then sometimes there are obviously things built in. So, but it's just good to go in to get the creative juices flowing in your meeting by knowing about some of these milestones in advance. And then the final thing to do is to identify targets. Ahead of your campaign planning session, identify targets. So a target, what do I mean by that? A target is a key decision maker who are attempting to influence on our campaign. It can be a member of Congress, the president, the governor, state legislator, really any key decision maker at any level. The key thing to remember about your targeting conversations is that it's about both inside game and outside game. And what I mean by that is inside game, lobbying, direct contact, our powers of persuasion, our ability to use facts and reason to bring people to our side, right? Outside game is about public pressure. How do we turn the heat up on these decision makers to make them vote for wildlife or take action for wildlife or be champions for wildlife, whatever your goal might be. So you don't want to limit yourself to only thinking about the outside game when picking targets. You really want to think about the whole picture at this phase, this first phase. Who do we need to vote with us in order to win, and who is going to need public pressure? And there's a whole set of criteria, suggested criteria that's in the worksheet, which I won't spend a lot of time on. Targeting could be a whole hour plus by itself, but I encourage you to take a look more at the materials. And if you have questions about this, I'd love to talk more. I will just give a quick example of targeting from our Clean Water for All campaign. We know that our strategy is to maintain a Senate firewall to prevent attacks to Clean Water Act authority. And we determined a set of criteria for picking which targets we were going to have, which is that we have the ability to influence these people because we have a strong ground game, we have good messengers, we have the ability to do that outside pressure, and because it's a swing strategy, pretty much most of our targets really are folks who need a lot of that outside pressure. And the other criteria is that they're moderate swings who need the political cover. And that kind of, with the whole team and a lot of conversations, brought us to this list of Senate targets, and that really led to where we made primarily field or outside game investments. There's a whole other list of folks that the water team talks to and works with, and it's a much longer targeting list beyond this, but this is just a quick snapshot of our high priority folks. Okay, so we're done with worksheet 1. At this phase, whoever's the lead, program lead for the campaign, legislative lead, those folks have been meeting and talking and hashing all of these initial questions out till we have some pretty clear pictures of our goals, our strategy, our target, and timing, and are ready to move forward. So the next piece, and this is at the end of the first worksheet, is to make sure you're thinking about who to invite to a broader stakeholder meeting and to do the campaign planning. So really thinking broadly about who should be on that list of invitations, who's going to be an important voice in the room. Then we're in worksheet 2, the campaign planning session itself, and then there's also, I will just share 2 things. This is what worksheet 2 looks like. Again, it looks like a worksheet, a lot of words and some blanks, which we don't expect you to all fill it in here, but rather would download it and type in your own thoughts. And then this is just the campaign planning guide. It's a PowerPoint presentation that walks through sample agendas, norm setting, and then a lot of the stuff that we've already talked about. If you were going into a campaign planning session and wanted to use this template, you would pre-populate, instead of having these prompting questions, you would pre-populate these slides with the answers that you've already come up with. You would say, this is what we've decided our campaign goal is, this is our organizational goal, strategy, et cetera. The other resource you'll use over the course of a campaign planning session is the tactics resource, which I'll get to in just a moment. Back to presentation mode here. So you've done your prep, you've sent out invitations, and then you've gotten ready by pre-populating that PowerPoint with a review of your goals, strategies, timing, targets. This is a genuine opportunity to build buy-in and receive genuine feedback. You want all the other stakeholders you're inviting to the session to really know that you're hearing them and that you're willing to change your plan. None of these things are set in stone. Having said that, I believe a lot in collaboration, but I also believe a lot in leadership. So one pitfall I've seen with campaign planning sessions is that you attempt to incorporate all the feedback that you're hearing in real time, and I think that's where sometimes those conversations can really get derailed, where you get stuck on long conversations about goals and reformulating your goals. Instead, I would just encourage folks to capture really good notes and assign someone to make sure they're identifying where feedback might need to be incorporated. And then that small group of folks who are leading the campaign take that feedback after the session and really sort through it, make some determinations about what makes sense to incorporate and change and what makes sense to just keep going forward with. The next thing, as you're going through your target list, and the second worksheet walks through this as well, it's an opportunity to get feedback on those targets and help you prioritize who are the most important folks on that list for a win, and also who are the field targets, who are the folks who really need an outside game versus an inside game. So you can start to do some of that prescriptive analysis. Again, that's a moment to hear that feedback, capture that feedback, and possibly sort through it, after the fact. If this is a campaign where folks only have like 1 or 2 targets that on the entire campaign, like the whole thing is a governor strategy and you're just trying to get the governor to do the right thing, then this is a great moment to do some power mapping. And power mapping is identifying key influencers to your targets. Sometimes these people are called secondary targets. But the key is that these are proper nouns, whether that's a newspaper, a specific newspaper, geography, organization, business, or individual. It's identifying who has a lot of influence on our target and how much access do we have to that entity or person. And I'll go into this a little bit more later, so I'm just going to blow past it. The next piece of your campaign planning session, once you've gotten all your feedback on the stuff you've come in prepared with, is to get an inventory of your assets. Really think about the goals of the campaign and who are all the people you might want to engage. Obviously, affiliates are our first folks we should be engaging. Hopefully, many of them are already part of our campaign planning session in the first place, but you may want to think about other affiliates maybe that aren't at the table yet. And then think about other NWF programs and how can they be incorporated into it. And these are just some of our great programs I listed. Are there coalitions involved that exist or are housed through NWF that you want to engage? Those are just the internal, and then you want to also think about external examples. So this is, again, this will be a theme throughout the campaign planning session, is that I truly believe that big group conversations really should be about getting everyone's best thinking and brainstorms and good ideas and capturing them. So this is another example of where that's really, really useful to find out all of the assets that the organization and our partners have. The next piece of this worksheet 2 talks about limitations or challenges, anticipating some of the challenges or hurdles you're likely to face. It's better to face those and account for them as you continue to build out your campaign. One example I use for this is that, again, drawing back to our Clean Water for All campaign work, When we were initially working on the Clean Water Rule, it was a challenge that our opposition is the Farm Bureau, because obviously they're super powerful, but they're also not great villains for us when we're messaging. People associate them with farmers. People like farmers. We all like eating and growing food. It's wonderful. And so it was never good when we were attacking the Farm Bureau. And so we had to acknowledge that challenge, that our opposition was super influential and also not a good villain for us, and instead focus on what our assets are, which is that clean water polls really, really well. And so as long as we kept talking about clean drinking water and kept focused on that message, then we were going to be much more successful. So that's an example of like acknowledging that challenge and then finding ways throughout your campaign to make sure you're working around it and addressing it. The next piece of your campaign planning session, the most fun part, I think, is when you get to start brainstorming tactics. Again, this is all about really thinking big and being creative. You know, I have rules for brainstorming, which are basically there's no budget, it's always yes and, we're not shooting down ideas, and just to let people really be creative. So this is a moment to do that. These are examples of what tactics might be. But the rule of thumb, because I think a lot of times I get confused between goals and strategies and tactics and what is what. But the thing that's sort of easiest for me to wrap my head around is if it is a specific action that we're taking, it's a tactic. So an opinion media push in order to influence a specific target might be a strategy, but an op-ed signed by a particular grass top would be a tactic. So that's just something I use to kind of test in my mind as I get sucked into this process, like, oh, wait, am I actually talking about tactics now, and did I get away from strategies? So if that's helpful, use it. The next piece, once you've brainstormed lots of tactics, you want to also evaluate each of them. So this is where you're going to look back to your goals and strategies and really test your tactic. Does this tactic actually align with the strategies we said we were going to do? Does it move our targets on the issue, and will it help us reach our goals? So once you're kind of done with the big brainstorm, the next step is to look through each tactic that's been proposed or brought up, each creative idea, and really evaluate whether it makes sense. And then the final piece is to actually lay that all of those tactics that you've decided you definitely do want to do, they do move our targets, and put those on a calendar so that it becomes more of an actual plan. And this is where the tactics resource sheet, I think, is really valuable. Because that gives you some really good tips and best practices around how to build out your calendar. So phase one of the campaign is really leaving time in your timelines, in your campaign plans, for building the campaign. Doing this stuff, creating the actual plans, determining who the leadership is going to be and what the structures are, determining the resources you're going to need to make those campaigns effective. And then you want to leave a little bit of time for entering the community. Entering the community is the concept of learning about a new community by listening, gathering information, and building relationships. So in this phase of the campaign, there are no asks. It's just about learning as much as you can. So the classic example of this is like, you know, when I was 22 and I was just out of college, I would get sent to like Nacogdoches, Texas, to work on the Keystone Pipeline. I didn't know anything about Nacogdoches, Texas. I'm from New Jersey. So I had to go figure out, like, what are the major media outlets? Who are the city councilors? Who are the thought leaders here? Who are people listening to? What do people here actually care about? So I talked to a lot of different community members. I talked to scientists. I talked to city councilors, all kinds of activists and leaders on the ground, and I got a much better sense of what people care about, and that helped shape the rest of my work on the campaign. So that's sort of the classic example. I think a lot of times we're working with affiliates who really know their community in some ways, but I still think that entering the community is valuable and important because even if you know your community really well in a broad sense, you may be working on a brand new issue, and each issue focus has its own set of stakeholders and actors and people and history, and so spending the time really learning and listening in any new space that you're moving into, whether that's a new geography or just a new issue area, is something you should definitely build in. I also will just plug that this is particularly critical when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work, and as we're engaging and organizing in frontline communities, spending the time to really hear from that community is just a step that we should not be skipping. So that's phase 2. Then you want to build time in your plan for education on the issue, getting people familiar with it, and then finally phase 3, building to action. And building to action is engaging people at one level and then slowly increasing their level of engagement over time. And this is called a ladder of engagement. I'm going to talk a little bit about ladders of engagement. You can talk about, there are ladders of engagement for grassroots activists, for grassroots activists, for decision makers. There are examples of this in the tactics resource sheet that walk through sample ladders. But it's something along the lines of so in a grassroots context, you might have someone sign a petition, and then the next time you ask them to do something, they are attending a rally or event, and then the next time they're speaking at the rally. And so you want to, obviously, ladders of engagement are focused around specific people rather than campaigns. But keeping a ladder of engagement in mind when you're building your timeline for a campaign can be really valuable. You don't want to have your rally be the first thing on your calendar because you haven't given your activists time to be educated on the issue, mobilized, and sort of built into a leadership position. So what you might do is, like, the first phase of the campaign might be, we're going to have a big petition drive because then we're going to give lots of opportunity for people to meet us at sort of the lowest rung of the ladder. And then in the middle of the campaign, we're going to have a big rally where people can show up to something in person. And then later in the campaign, we're going to have a series of lobby visits all across the state because now I have all these fantastic leaders who are sophisticated speakers and can go in for visits. So, thinking about that ladder as you're building your timeline just, again, can be super helpful. Now we're at worksheet 3. So this is the end of your campaign planning session, the third worksheet, which again I'll just pull up. my screensaver is my dog, Marty McFly. So worksheet number 3 is walking through ground truthing. So again, I just wanted to give you guys a visual on what all these worksheets look like, but and I'll just show the tactics resource one as well as here, and you can see there are sample ladders of engagement. When you're at worksheet, what do I mean by ground truthing? So ground truthing is the final phase of the planning process when you're testing all of your plan's assumptions by overlaying real-world factors that's going to influence your ability to be successful. So this is basically, I like to think that all the pre-planning, all of the campaign planning session, all those first 2 worksheets is when we get to be strategic, brilliant thinkers. We get to think big, be creative. Now we have to kind of come back to the real world and ask questions like, do we have the budget for this activity? Or do we need to raise the money? So it's not necessarily, no, we don't have the budget, we can't do it. It can be, no, we don't have the budget, we need to get to money. But a lot of times we have funders that have really specific parameters around our campaign. So looking at our plan and saying, if we execute this, are we going to satisfy any existing grants that we have to do this work? That's important. And do we have the necessary staffing and capacity to actually execute all of these big ideas? What would we need to do to get there? Those are just some examples of ways in which we ground truth. So again, that budget I talked about. You also want to think about all of the tactics you've chosen in terms of specific targets. So again, I mentioned if you only have 1 or 2 targets, ideally you've done a power map before you've gotten to this place. But for many of our federal campaigns, we have like 15, 20 targets on campaigns. We can't power map all of them together in a meeting. That's way too much. So at this is when we would then go and ask people closer to the ground who know the targets about to do that power mapping, and then try and look at our set of tactics and align it with the targets that we're trying to move and make sure that those are really effective. This is also the moment, as we know more about our targets, to really think about creating materials and messaging and considering our communications. What is our communication strategy going to be? And then finally, this is the phase I think I run into the most as someone who works on federal campaigns. We will create these sort of broad tactics, like let's say, please hold a roundtable conversation about climate change in your state. And then this is where a specific state or community may take that plan and find ways to make it salient for where they live. So an example of that would be saying, okay, I know that Senator Casey in Pennsylvania really cares about faith and really cares about children's health. So my roundtable is going to be populated by health professionals and faith leaders who are going to talk about climate change in specifically a moral frame and a health frame. So again, that's sort of bringing it closer to the ground, closer to what makes these tactics or these big ideas really actionable. This is just an example of a power map, and again, I did Senator Casey because I've worked a lot in Pennsylvania, so it's a target I know relatively well. But this is actually what a physical power map looks like. It is 4 buckets of public influencers, so that's media, social media, organizations, maybe geographies or specific regions that they care about, personal influencers of the target, their wife, their mother, best friend, best man at their wedding. That's a real example from Montana that I heard. Someone found the best man from someone's wedding and got them to lobby on a wildlife issue, so that's like a slam dunk. VIP influencers, that's other elected officials. If we found out that Senator Casey really loved Bruce Springsteen and we could get him to talk to him, that would be great. That's those kinds of folks. And then financial influencers, which is basically, for the most part, shorthand for donors, campaign donors to our targets, for the most part. So you want to think about, again, everyone, this is a brainstorm, everybody in all of those 4 buckets, and then really think about who has the most influence over those targets among that group, and who do we as an organization or as a broader conservation community have the most access to. And really prioritize targeting as secondary targets the folks on this map or the organizations who kind of both have the most influence and we have the most access. This is just a sample communication strategy, what I mean by all of these pieces. Again, this could be its own session, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it's thinking about your audience, who is your audience, and as specific as you can be to who your target is and who matters to that target. That really helps you narrow your audience. Your audience should not be the American people. That's not an audience. It should be a proper noun. It should be really specific. And then you want to think about, once you've identified that audience, where are they on the issue? Are they sort of ready for our messaging? Are they educated yet? What might be some of their core concerns that you want to anticipate? And then you want to think about theme. What's your big picture appeal in the campaign? And then obviously we all talk a lot about message. What's the top line message? All of your communications tactics, every op-ed, every editorial board memo, every tweet should be supporting this particular message. And then who are the clear messengers? And again, being as specific to your target as possible on this, who will resonate for that person or for that audience. So this is an example of a ballot campaign that I worked on in California back in 2010. And it was these two Texas oil companies were funding this ballot proposition that would have repealed California's global warming law, landmark global warming law. So this was a great one. I love to use this for communication strategy because it had really great villains like Texas oil companies, which for Californians, they're not fans of Texas or oil. And we particularly were looking, California voters, but we were particularly looking at liberal pockets at our base. This was really about mobilizing super pro-environment folks. So we were in particularly these communities. We assessed that the audience that we were talking about really didn't know about this ballot proposition. It was already a midterm election. It was low turnout. So a lot of what we needed to do was really educate. The core concerns that people have were really people there value the environment, and they also value California's right to make their own laws and not have other people from outside the state come in. The big picture is that California is a world leader on the environment, and we have to protect that leadership. So that was our theme, and our message was get Texas oil out of California's environmental laws, hell no, on 23, which was the name of the ballot proposition. And then the messenger were local elected officials. We got state legislators, we got students and young people. These were all good folks. So this is just a little example. All right. Finally, once you've done all your ground truthing, you've neatened up your plan, it all makes sense for the people who are going to execute it. Now we're up to our campaign checklist. And the campaign checklist, again, I'll just take a moment to show what that tool looks like. This walks through all the different buckets that you need to be thinking about in getting a campaign off the ground. So that is A, planning. Have you done your campaign planning? Do you know who's on your team? Have you done a MOCA? So for those who haven't been to a management center training, this is a tool to designate specific roles within a campaign structure. Do you have a contact sheet? Then you might want to think about things like internal communication. So that's like listservs. Where are we storing materials, and can all the right people access those materials? Are we having regular calls? Who's in charge of them? All of those kinds of things. Reporting and accountability, thinking through, do we have a clear system for tracking everything that's happening? Do we have debriefs that are going to be scheduled after key moments on the campaign? Rapid response. I think we get really confused in using the term rapid response because most of the rapid response we do is actually like slow-moving rapid response. It's things like 3 weeks from now, we're going to have to respond really rapidly to something, right? So there's no reason for us to be caught off guard, and to the extent that we can have a team identified ahead of time that knows what they're supposed to do in those moments to respond quickly to something that's going to happen, and having those types of plans written out or gamed out is really valuable. But again, we don't always know. Sometimes we do have to genuinely respond to something that's a total curveball, but that's where having that team in place, knowing who the decision makers are, is kind of the most important piece. And then thinking through field. What are all of the do we have organizers? Have we engaged our affiliates? Are they up and running? Have they been briefed on the issue or received all the training or orientation they need? Do we have materials that will help them to be successful? So this is just, I think these are things that all of us do all the time on campaigns constantly, but I know for me, there are very few campaigns I can point to that I've done all of these things, because I think every time I'm sort of re-going through this list in my head and I forget stuff. So this is just a useful tool to remind folks of kind of all the things to be thinking about as you're getting a campaign kind of on its legs. That is the campaign checklist, and that is the end of the toolkit. Those are all the pieces. So we have 9 minutes left. I talked a lot. I'm going to take a drink of water now. Do folks have questions? Preferably in the room, because I'm not sure how the technology works well enough to I'm going to look for any hand raised, or if anyone knows how to unmute their phone.
Ask in the chat too.
Yeah, you can also ask in the chat if you're having trouble being heard.
What's your experience of what's the thing that people fail to do or don't do?
Yeah. I think honestly the goals and strategy, I think we skip to tactics is sort of the most common thing that we go, okay, we have X thing we need to do, let's just do some stuff. Let's take out our bag of tricks and pick some that we feel like we can do quickly. So I think that's probably the thing that comes up the most. The other thing is I find, at least I'll speak for myself, I find that I don't always think really specifically about the target that we're trying to move and think about tactics in terms of what's going to be influential to that person. So the more specific that we can be, I think would be the thing that helps me most. I don't know, what do other people think? There are other campaigners in the room.
This seems like one area that's tricky for people in campaigns is getting grasshoppers involved. Is there any tips for that? Might want to repeat questions too.
Yeah, so the question was that there's a challenge around getting grass tops involved in a campaign. Yeah, I have I think that could be its own training almost on a specific skill of how to recruit grass tops and get them engaged. But I think the thing that's in here that I find valuable to that point are the ladders of engagement and really thinking about spending the time with a grass top to really learn about their perspective and what they already care about, and then building asks around their interests and expertise, so that it really feels like you're asking them to do something instead of I need someone to do this thing. Can it be you? Rather being hey, I know that you communicate really well on this, tell this really important, powerful story, and I really would appreciate it if you specifically could say that at our next rally or whatever. So again, it's all of these things. When we're at a macro level, it's really hard, but the more we can be really specific to the person. That's my little. But we could do another hour on that.
We'll do that sometime.
I don't know. Anyone else have questions or thoughts on this, or?
Kim, this is Caroline. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi.
Oh, great. So, yeah, I think I'll just plug from a slightly different angle the sort of need to educate before asking. I think we see that a lot in kind of the online space for communicating to, say, activists or members, is that suddenly a tactic will just pop up and need to be communicated, but there's not that sort of cultivation and education of the topic. So I feel like we're leaving a lot of success on the table because we're not taking the time to incorporate that kind of bigger kind of mass communication, if you will, and just telling people about the issue and why it matters before just going to the ask. So I wanted to plug that aspect as well.
Yeah. Yeah. What are some challenges that people feel like they've faced in trying to do this? Obviously, this is a perfect situation where you're in a vacuum and you can answer all these questions very neatly, and then you get down to a real campaign and things get complicated and messy and And so I'm just curious if folks have had any particular challenges with building a campaign.
Well, one of the obvious ones is resources. You can lay out a soup to nuts campaign, even a small scale one, but resources, the lack of them, or that it's tailored to certain things than others, then that's where you start it starts to implode.
Yeah.
Yeah. Money matters.
Money matters. Yeah, I think one challenge I have with like the education piece that Caroline was just talking about and the entering the community piece of building out your timeline is that requires you to leave a lot of time where you're like not necessarily going to have deliverables.
Yeah.
And when you're dealing with funders, that's a real problem. So I don't have a perfect solution to that. I just wanted to acknowledge that challenge. And
well, that's another challenge, which is the pulse of the campaign. There can be some downtime that's not advantageous, but as you guys would always say, you got to feed the field. So what is the field doing, or whatever, to keep the issue alive, and yet not kind of grind through your resources or do ineffective things.
Right. Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts or questions or parting concepts?
I thought that this was great. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
It's phenomenal. It's really, really useful. It's inspiring.
I have one more question if there's still time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay. So I'm calling from Nebraska, from the Nebraska Wildlife Federation. And most of the work that I do, like we started an outdoor family initiative, and so I don't do very much with legislation and working on advocacy in terms of litigation. Like, I really like this format, and I think that I can really use it to work with my companions and getting more families outdoors and learning about nature. Do you have like a format that's not so legislation focused?
Ooh, that's a great question. I would love to create that. I don't right now have like an alternative version, but I agree. I think it's definitely obviously targeted to specific moving policy. That is how I designed the tool, how we designed the tool, I should say. It's a team effort. But I do hope that there are a lot of pieces of it that will be valuable even now to sort of modify and use in other contexts. I always joke with my boss, Claudia Malloy, that we both wrote campaign plans for our weddings because I think campaign plans can be used for whatever goal you might have. Just methodically think through how do you achieve those things that you want to achieve. So I hope that there are pieces of this that are valuable, but I would love to create, I think that's a goal for the future for me, to create a tool that isn't so explicitly sort of policy focused in the language that we use in the toolkit.
Well, I'm definitely going to use this as a platform, and hopefully I'll be able to edit it and kind of make it a little bit more particular to doing events and outreach here.
Good. Awesome.
Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for being on. All right. Well, I'm sure folks have questions, but it's 4 o'clock, so I want to respect the time. Thank you all so much for getting on and listening. Apologies again for the technical difficulties at the beginning, but I'm glad we were able to keep it to 4 o'clock and get through everything. And I look forward to talking to many of you a lot more about this in the future at the annual meeting and beyond. Enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great Memorial Day recess.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was down to the second.